Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, our moderator for this afternoon is an award-winning journalist who began her career as a Dallas Assistant District Attorney and at the age of 30 was elected the youngest judge in Texas history. As a fixture of major U.S. network news, she has had the opportunity to witness modern legal history unfold. Please welcome Ms. Catherine Cryer.
Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the new United Nations organization, UN Women, welcome to our presentation of its first major report entitled Progress of the World's Women in Pursuit of Justice. It was just a year ago that the United Nations General Assembly voted unanimously to create UN Women, the first new agency in decades. The woman chosen to head this flagship organization has a distinguished history of public service and promoting the rights of women. As a doctor, as a minister of both health and defense in Chile, and as that nation's first female president, Ms. Bachelet created a visionary strategic plan for UN Women, and critically, she has mobilized the financial and political support needed to achieve the goals of justice, equality, and human rights. Please join me in welcoming Undersecretary General and UN Women Executive Director, Ms. Michelle Bachelet.
Thank you, Catherine. Good afternoon, Excellencies and distinguished guests, and welcome to this launch of the first UN Women Flagship Report, Progress of the World's Women in Pursuit of Justice. Progress of the World's Women is a global assessment of advances towards gender equality. It aims to inspire bold action by governments and civil society to meet their commitments and accelerate the achievement of women's rights worldwide. For our first major report, we have chosen to focus on women's access to justice. This stems from the recognition that laws and justice systems that work well are the foundation for gender equality and social justice. In taking up this issue, the report also highlights the fact that although the rule of law is a cherished principle and a cornerstone of democracy governance worldwide, too many countries still, the rule of law rules women out. As the report documents, laws that discriminate against women are found in every region. And even where the laws are gender equitable, there are vast implementation gaps. Meanwhile, the institution of justice, the police, the courts, or the legal aid system too often fail to meet women's needs. Globally, 600 million women and girls live in countries that do not outlaw domestic violence. More than half the world's working women are in vulnerable jobs, outside the purview of labor legislation. 1 million of girls are married young, exposed to the risk of early pregnancy and childbirth, one of the biggest killers of adolescent girls in the world. It is also true that despite the reality, laws can change society by creating new norms, which challenge gender stereotypes and change attitudes and practices. And justice systems can provide the means for women to demand accountability, to put a stop to violence in their relationship and their neighborhoods, to claim citizenship rights, to get married and divorced on equal terms to men, or to claim the land, inheritance, or pay to which they are entitled. In fact, the courts have been the site of some groundbreaking legal decisions, many of which we highlight in the report. Women all over the world have relied on the courts to get justice, winning decisions that benefit not only themselves, but expand access to justice for millions of other women. To take just one example, in Rajasthan, in India, Banwari Devi was carrying out her duties as a social worker. In fact, she was trying to prevent a young girl, a child, from being married off to an older man. To punish her for defending the girl's rights, local men raped Banwari. Not satisfied with trying to get justice for herself, With the support of 5 women's organizations, Banwari took the case to the Indian Supreme Court. There she won watershed recognition of sexual harassment at work wherever it takes place. In the absence of a law, the court imposed legally binding guidelines applicable to the public and private sector to prevent this crime from ever happening again. Since then, the government of India has introduced a new bill on sexual harassment, and Banwari's action has inspired similar cases in Bangladesh and a new law in Pakistan. As a result, nearly 500 million women in those 3 countries alone now have the legal protection to go about their work free from abuse and violence. In fact, beyond South Asia, there have been remarkable transformations in legal frameworks. In our comprehensive review of legislation, we found that 2/3 of countries now have laws against domestic violence, which is an extraordinary shift even from 10 years ago. And this shift is important not only because of the protection it affords women, but also because it signals a willingness on the part of governments to regulate the private sphere as well as the public domain. For centuries, the private domain, the home and the family, has been considered outside of justice. Domestic violence has been seen as a private matter, perpetrated with almost complete impunity. Rape within marriage has not been recognized as a crime. In warfare, until the last 2 decades, sexual violence was viewed as an inevitable byproduct, or at best, a violation of family honor, rather than the deliberate and corrosive tactic of warfare that is now recognized to be. Even the places that women work in family businesses, in the home as domestic workers, or in factories and corporations in all countries have remained largely unregulated, exposing women to widespread harassment and often exploitation and abuse. As Banwari Devi found, sexual harassment and abuse have long been accepted as a normal part of working life for women. This means that when women cannot inherit property, pass on citizenship to their children, or initiate a divorce, society learns to accept it as just the way that things are, rather than the injustice that it is. Injustice is not inevitable or natural. It's not unique to any system of government or the basis of any culture or religion, and we can't change that. Laws provide accountability for individuals and can also change the way that society behaves. In pursuit of justice shows that in countries that do not have laws on domestic violence, on average, half of the women and men think that violence against women is sometimes acceptable. But in countries with these laws, less than a quarter of people believe this to be so. Where laws and policies encourage men to take on a bigger share of caregiving work in the household, the gender pay gap is smaller. By enabling women to enter the labor market on more equal terms to men, women can demand the pay to which they are justly entitled, thereby strengthening economic security for themselves and their families. Progressive social change flows from laws that guarantee equality for women, and everyone benefits. Of course, legislating is essential, but it's only the first step. And effective implementation of those legal frameworks is essential. In Nepal, legal changes to recognize women's inheritance rights since the early 90s did not have a noticeable impact until the government introduced tax exemptions for land transfers to women. So by providing incentives to men to share land with their daughters, their sisters, or their wives, the number of women who own land has increased threefold. Laws and implementations matter, but so does the delivery of justice. The rule of law requires that the police and the courts apply the law fairly and without bias. Here, too, the report shows more ways in which the rule of law rules women out. But it also highlights a number of innovative ways to overcome these problems. In many instances, women simply cannot afford the high cost of judicial procedures. In Kenya, for example, claiming land in an inheritance case can involve 17 different administrative steps, costing up to $800, which is equivalent to an entire year's income for an average Kenyan. Few busy women with families to care for and work to do outside the home can afford the time, let alone the cost of pressing such a claim, however badly they need that property. It is still the case in many countries that women are very reluctant to report crimes to the police. The fear of social stigma can be overwhelming for women, particularly in case of sexual violence, crimes where the victim is often more stigmatized than the perpetrator. When victims feel that they themselves will be on trial, there is little incentive to seek justice. With only 5% of reported cases ending in a conviction in some European countries, and fewer still, 5%, and fewer still in many other countries, it is surprising that women come forward at all. Putting women on the front line of law enforcement makes a difference. Our report shows for the first time that in countries where there are more women in the police, reporting of sexual assaults increases. And we know this from experience. The presence of the all-women police brigade sent to post-conflict Liberia increased reporting of violence against women, but it also boosted recruitment of women into the police force, creating a new generation of gender-sensitive law enforcers. With barriers to justice at every stage, putting services together increases women's access to justice. The fewer steps a woman has to take, the more likely she is to pursue justice. So one-stop shops have been used in a number of countries and are proving to be a low-cost approach to reducing the attrition in the justice chain. Whether as police or judges, as parliamentarians or activists, women can play a critical role in driving the change we need to see. In those countries that have seen large increases in women's representation in political decision-making, progressive laws on labor rights, on social rights, healthcare, education, and so on, but also on property, often follow. Women have demanded changing laws that discriminate against them, shaping new laws and policies to drive forward positive change. Amplifying women's voices is especially important in legal systems based on custom, religious, or ethnic identity. The report draws on examples from Burundi to Ecuador, Pakistan to Mexico, where women activists have made it clear that culture or religion cannot be used as an excuse to justify gender discrimination and injustice. These women firmly reject the notion that justice is the privileged domain of the few, invoking universal principles of human rights and applying them to their own realities. In Ecuador, the Constitution guarantees women the right to participate in indigenous governance and justice system. Women are claiming that right and developing their own statutes based on indigenous justice principle to put a stop to the violence and discrimination they face. In the Middle East and North Africa, UN Women is supporting women to be at the forefront of change, helping them to influence and shape their futures. Tunisia, which has long been on the leading edge of gender equality reform in the region, has recently adopted a 50-50 parity law for political representation for the list to go into the soon election in October for the Constituent Assembly, putting women in the driving seat to demand further change. This year's progress report contains proven and achievable recommendations that cut across all of UN Women's strategic priorities for realizing a vision of gender equality, including putting in place laws to end violence against women, making justice system work for women, ensuring women's voices are heard in decision-making, securing women's access to decent work and land, and delivering transformative justice for women in the aftermath of conflict. The edition of Progress builds on the work of all UN Women partners in governments, in civil society, and in the United Nations to strengthen the rule of law. It outlines a vision for the future in which women and men worldwide can work side by side to make gender equality and women's empowerment a reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Bachelet. Now let me introduce the rest of the distinguished guests. As Botswana's first female High Court judge, Unity Dow was able to parlay her experience as a defender of women's rights to evoke change throughout her country. Notably, she was the plaintiff in a case that allowed children of Botswanan women fathered by foreign nationals to be considered Botswanan. Tradition and precedent had stated that nationally only descendants from the father would be considered Botswanan. Since her court victory, all children born of Botswanan mothers have citizenship rights. She has now authored 5 novels which highlight her experience and expertise in how poverty plays a significant role in gender issues. In the 2011 Women of the World Summit, Ms. Dow was recognized as one of the women who shake the world, and she most certainly does. Please welcome Unity Dow. As lead counsel in the largest employment gender discrimination case in United States history, David Sanford successfully fought for some 6,200 women against pharmaceutical giant Novartis in the famed Velez versus Novartis trial. The jury awarded $250 million in punitive damages. The judge in the case praised the settlement negotiated for the women as exceptional and one of a kind. The case serves as an example of how the rights of women to equal pay and opportunities for promotion cannot and should not be ignored. David is a founding and managing partner of the national law firm Sanford, Whittles, and Heisler. It's a delight to welcome a counselor extraordinaire, David Sanford. Laura Turkay is the head writer of the Progress of the Women's World Report, of the World's Women Report. She came to this important role after a decade of advocating for women's rights. Before joining UN Women, she was the Women's Rights Advisor at Action Aid UK in London, worked with the UK Institute of Development Studies, and has authored many important articles on women's rights. Please welcome the report's ultimate resource, Laura Turkay. Now, before we begin, we've asked some of our UN Women colleagues around the globe what justice means to them. Take a look.
The quest for justice is central to UN Women's mission. We are seeking global gender justice.
Justice, to me, is about setting a wrong right.
Justice means equity, fair institutions, and individual accountability.
Equality between everyone, regardless of their religion, gender, affiliations, ideologies.
Justice is equality, fairness, and the right to be heard.
Fair treatment, rule of law, and being honest.
Two genders, equal rights, equal opportunities, no discrimination, no sexism.
Justice is reparation. Justice is healing.
Accountability of perpetrators, reconciliation between communities, and it also means a form of truth-telling.
Justice is, as a principle, for me, is about fairness, is about equity.
Dignity, humanity.
Justice is being heard, acknowledged, and compensated for experiences of inequality.
Justice is rights in action for everyone, everyone, everyone.
I'd now like to start the panel discussion by asking the participants what justice means to each of them. Ms. Bachelet, I would ask you to begin for us.
Well, I feel very representative of all of that I already heard, I have to say, because for me, justice is equal rights for men and women, but in a political, social, and cultural, and of course, judicial environment that not only protects and respects, but also promotes those rights, but also where women and men can really lead very fulfilled lives. Equality means justice means a strong legal framework that can produce this environment where these rights can be achieved, but on the other hand, where the system can ensure that the enormous obstacles that women face in access to justice can be really have gender responsive response that are tailored in the sense that we really, this whole big goal that we have, that equality really is a reality, is not lip service. So that is what justice means to me. But it also means truth. It means in many other, in other moments in conflict countries and post-conflict, it means also reconciliation and reparation.
Absolutely. Unity?
Justice for me means safety and security. It means 3 meals a day. I think justice for me means being warm at night, being able to reach my full potential, and a system that ensures that all those things happen, and that when they don't happen, there's some place I can go to make sure that they happen. So that for me is justice.
David.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you for having me. I feel humbled and honored to be a part of this distinguished guest list here.
You're more than a token.
Yeah. Justice is complicated, but if I had to reduce it to 3 words, I'd think about the appearance. It's important in any legal system and any system of justice to have the appearance of justice, to have a process that's open so that people feel as though they have open access to courts, and that the outcomes, although not guaranteed to be right, are right more often than not. And in one recent case, and I wanted to talk about this a little bit, and I'll just spend 1 minute doing it, a case against Walmart is a gender discrimination class action that many people here probably know about. And in a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court ruled that the women could not come together, collectivizing and bringing the case as a class action. The case is wrongly decided for very many reasons, but I'm going to give you 2 reasons that I think about when I think about justice. One is the appearance problem. Justice Scalia wrote the opinion, and his son is a partner in a law firm, Gibson Dunn, which represented Walmart in the case. So that gives you one sense of what justice is not, at least as far as I'm concerned. There's a second way in which the decision was wrong-headed, and that is that it didn't really give women access. It didn't allow women to engage in a process in order to get to a certain outcome. And I'd just like to read, if I may, 1 sentence from that decision. And this is Justice Scalia's majority decision. Left to their own devices, most managers in any corporation, and surely most managers in a corporation that forbids sex discrimination, would select sex-neutral, performance-based criteria for hiring and promotion. Now let that sit for a moment, because what Justice Scalia is saying is that if there's a policy against discrimination, surely most people wouldn't discriminate. Now, I don't know what world Justice Scalia lives in, but it's not the world that I've lived in for 15 years involved in civil rights litigation.
I'll just nod knowingly. Laura?
Well, I think after 2 years of working on this report, justice for me is being at this launch and launching the report. So, but also, I think working on this issue and lots of other women's rights issues, it seems to me that justice is about being heard, having the right to be heard in your life, and having the opportunities to have control over your life, and you know, whether that's in the home or in the workplace or in parliaments or whatever. And I think that right to participate and be heard is fundamental to making justice systems work for women, but also fundamental to women achieving their rights and fulfilling their potential.
Absolutely. Now, we never have enough time, but I've got a lot of questions to cover, so I would ask the participants to be somewhat succinct, but I would also add that rather than simply go from one to another with a question, if you have follow-up thoughts, I'd really like to have more of a dialogue than just questions. But David, let me start with you. You were the lead counsel on the Novartis equal pay case, and again, the largest class action gender discrimination case to get to trial and result in a victory. So what was the key to that victory?
I think there were 2 keys. The first and most significant factor clearly was the group of women who came together. It takes a lot of courage to come forward and file a lawsuit. It takes a lot more courage in these times when economically people feel so distressed. So when you bring a lawsuit in the United States alleging discrimination against your employer, the natural concern is one of retaliation, being blackballed in the industry, being fired, and a lot of people expressed those concerns. But nonetheless, we had 108 women from across the United States sign very detailed statements, many of whom then participated in depositions, some of whom came to New York to testify at trial. So a lot of people came together over a 7-year period to participate, and clearly without their participation, nothing would have happened.
So elaborate just a little bit about the role of the courts in recognizing and expanding economic rights for women.
Is there a role?
Yeah, just elaborate for us a little bit your perception of that role.
I don't, you know, in America, 40% of all mothers are the primary breadwinners in their family. And 25%, additional 25% of women contribute significantly economically to the household. And when you combine those statistics with the fact that women continue to make 77 cents on the dollar, you realize you have a problem. And there's a study that was recently published that suggests that if we close that gender gap, that 77 cents on the dollar, making it $1 on a dollar, we would reduce by half the poverty level among families in the United States. That's an extraordinary statistic. And so the role of the courts is not to ensure that women make $1 for every dollar of men. The role of the courts is to ensure that women are heard and have an opportunity to put on their case, and that's precisely what the Walmart court, the High Court, did not do.
Any other follow-up thoughts? Because Unity, I bet you might have some.
I would like to follow up on that because let me just reduce it to something that we often take for granted: child support. You know, I think child support as a contributor to women's poverty, is often not well acknowledged. And I think that if you think about, what it does, if you are earning 100 pula and he's earning 100 pula, and you are using your 100 pula to support yourself and 3 children, and he's only using his to support only himself, that's got so many limiting factors. It means that you can't even go out to work because you probably need to stay at home to make sure that you take care of the children. And also, I think often we take it for granted, but I think it's a very important economic issue. Is child support. And also actually, I was going to say also, what it does is actually place an unfair burden, and it's a sex discrimination issue. It places an unfair burden on the mother, to take care of children, and therefore it's actually paying for him, for herself and for him. And I think that's an important issue.
Especially?
Well, that's all of that's what we have been commented here is one of the reasons why we have focused so much on economic empowerment of women, because it's not only the right thing to do, because it's women. We know that the only possibility to achieve your right is you have some economic autonomy. And it's so important because it will also ensure what Unity was saying, to be warm, to have 3 meals a day, and so on. Because as it had been mentioned here, women really 90% of their incomes, they devoted to the family, to the education, to the health, to the conditions of the family. But on the other hand, it's not only good for women and for their families, but also it's essential for the community and for the society, because women are drivers of economy in many places. And what we see, we have different levels of unequal access to economic rights in terms of, in many places, women don't have access to inheritance, don't have access to land. In other places, and unfortunately it's too worldwide, the gap of salary between men and women is very high. It's an average of 30% that women performing the same job as a man in a good performance receive less salary. And that's it in developed world and also in developing world. But we also understand that we need to protect women's, I would say, labor conditions. And well, David was talking about one issue, but we just 2 weeks ago, the international community and countries and employers have approved a very important convention on domestic workers. For the first time in the history of humanity, we have defined that domestic work is a work and that it's entitled to have a lot of rights. So there's so much things to do. And in that sense, we can ensure that really while putting a lot of efforts on improving women's capacity of developing all their decisions in terms of economic opportunities, really the economy will improve. So that's why I think it's a matter of justice, but it's a matter of rights but it's also the smart thing to do, so everybody wins. So that's why we're going to push so hard on economic empowerment as one of the areas we're going to work on.
Yeah, as a major strategic goal
it's a
for
major
UN
strategic
Women.
goal, yes.
Well, Unity, you touched a little bit on when you're talking about things like child support, other issues, demonstrating that equal pay, and certainly your remarks, is just one piece of the puzzle when we're talking about economic justice. Are there other areas where you really feel that women have been hindered?
I think work environments, the extent to which they are hostile to women. I think many women across the world feel that when they go to the workplace, they don't just do the work for which they've been hired, they do other things as well. They have to serve and cater, and just it undermines the position within the workplace. Sexual harassment laws, I think many countries in the world don't have sexual harassment laws, and we know that it happens, and we know that it can decide whether or not you go up the ladder or you get a scholarship, the meritorious bonus. So I think the hostile work environment is a big issue.
Yeah, I would like to add that many women work in the world, but usually in informal kinds of jobs with no benefits at all. And for example, in traders, there is a lot of women working in trade across borders or inside the countries, but usually they are informal traders, and they don't have access to formal possibilities. So there's so much things to be done. Or if we look at the agricultural sector, in many places, women are an essential part of the agricultural labor force. But really, they don't have access to microcredits as easy as men. They don't have the land property, so sometimes whatever they do can be a problem because it's not going to be theirs, and that sometimes if they don't have the inheritance law, if the husband dies, that she's not entitled to continue even living in the land. So we need to work much more on supporting women's capacities in terms of their own activity, how they can be better producers because they will be also ensuring food security, nutrition, and so on, but also how they can have access to markets, how we can help them in managerial skills, and so on. And the last thing I want to mention in this issue is that so many women do, in many parts of the world, so high amount of unpaid work care. It's like caregivers in the case of HIV/AIDS, but many women, a third of the time, they use it in water fetching, firewood collection. So that brings us another issue. So if we can't tackle, for example, climate change, but we link it to that and we give to women green energy alternatives, they will be solving not only the climate change issue, but also improving their own lives. So we have to, we have a lot of things that we know that works and that we can do.
Laura, are there any things as author that we haven't touched on that you would really like the guests here today to pay attention to when looking at the economic issues?
I think one of the issues that we look at in quite a lot of detail in the report is around women's land rights, so ensuring that women have control over the land that they rely on for their livelihoods. And there was a recent report from the UN FAO which found that where women are given access to seeds and fertilizers and tools on a basis of equality with men, productivity increases enormously. But one of the other things that's really important is secure access to land, so that women aren't fearful that their land is going to be taken away. And there's things that can be done to ensure that through legal frameworks and so on. But as Ms. Bashley mentioned, inheritance rights are also very important, particularly in the context of HIV, so that women can inherit land and have secure access to land to support themselves and their families.
Well, Ms. Bashley, the report highlights the particular challenges that women face when it comes to accessing justice during and after wars and internal conflict. Now, there have been some notable advances in international law over the past couple of decades. 5 UN Security Council resolutions, which among other areas recognize women's roles in peace building. But what more can governments and the international community do to end impunity for the crimes against women in this context?
Well, I think one of the difficult situations for women in conflict, but particularly post-conflict, is that you need to deal with issues that are very complex, in a very fragile state that's just developing, and usually with very fragile institutions. So what we need to do, governments and international community supporting their efforts, is to support their efforts on all the transition to a more stable and democratic country in terms of how we developed the different systems, the judiciary system, in terms of how we develop, and we also tailored a kind of situations that maybe are not in the recipe book, but really respond to the concrete situation. I'm going to give a good example. You know, we all know that the Eastern Congo, in the DRC, there has been a lot of rape. But I mean, if you see the conflict in the world, in Bosnia, in Rwanda, in many places, I mean, rape has been a major means of war. And in many places have been established international courts, as you mentioned. But in the DRC, many of these rapes are occurring in very isolated places. So they had been, the government, trying to address these kind of issues in the last month. They have developed, with the help of the international community, mobile courts. So for example, in New Year's Eve, there was a rape about 50 women in Fiji. And what happened there, that a mobile court went there, and they did this sort of first crime against humanity trial there at the ground, where women could denounce what happened, where men were found guilty, and I hope that it will include also reparation for the women. So I would say that much more to be done, but it's very important because the reports clearly shows how difficult it is for women to have access to all the reasons that Unity mentioned and some others. How you can really have to sort of tailor the policies that will really respond to women's difficulties. And I have to say, this is not only about justice. In any policy, if you really don't think how will it work or not for women, we won't benefit women as we should. So I think in access to justice is so important to find all of the different moments where people at the end, I mean, can't you imagine somebody knocking at 17 different doors to get justice? I mean, probably in the number 11, half of the people gave up already, you know? So I think we really have to do much more, and every place has to have the laws, have the legal framework, identify all the laws that discriminate women, insist on justice. Mobile court is one example. But also then you have to ensure not only that they have access to not only that the perpetrators were, you know, convicted, but also how you ensure reparation, because women need reparation. And conviction of the perpetrator is so important, because it's a message you're sending to the society that this kind of things are unacceptable, because the conflict stops, the war stops, but the rapes continue. So we need to be very tough on this.
Yeah, David, whether it's violence or economic issues, when you commented about the 6,200 women, the 100 plus that were very brave to come forward, we think about the United States, but here, the access to the justice system for women who can't simply bring out the pocketbook, who can't pay often very expensive tabs, is a real problem. So this is not just more impoverished areas or more underdeveloped areas.
It is a real problem, and I think that, I don't think there have been any studies that have examined this, but I would guess that for every person who brings a case, there may be 10, 20, 30 or more people who won't bring up a case, primarily because they can't get a lawyer to bring it, and they don't have the money to bring it. So money and access still go hand in hand in the United States. And again, that's the part of the value of bringing together a lot of people and collectivizing. It's very difficult for one person to stand up and have it be Mary versus the company. Because if it's Mary versus the company, there's not only something extremely intimidating about doing that, but economically it's not feasible to do. And so most people can't do it. But most people can collectivize. They can bring their stories together and pool their resources in ways that allow them to level the playing field. And that's what we tried to do, at least up until a few weeks ago when the Supreme Court ruled.
I was going to say, we need to recognize that there has been intense pressure to reduce access to class actions.
Well, there has been, but that is based on a misunderstanding. The view of a lot of people is that, well, there are too many class actions. It's about lawyers making money. It really isn't about that. In fact, I came upon a statistic recently. From 2000 to 2010, in the District Court in Massachusetts, there were 9 employment class action cases filed, discrimination cases. And of the 9 in that entire decade, 2 were certified as a class action. So 2 courts allowed all the people to come together and proceed to trial, 2 cases in a decade. I suspect that those numbers will be diminished in the next decade, again, because of the Walmart decision.
Yeah, Laura, you had a positive note in the report when we were talking about post-conflict moments, that actually those can be extraordinary opportunities as well. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I mean, as Ms. Bachelet said, the conflict contexts are obviously profound moments of crisis, but often post-conflict, when societies are rebuilding and new constitutions are being written and so on, any transition, including in the Middle East and North Africa, there's also a real opportunity for women to be involved in rewriting the constitutions, to write women's rights into the fabric of their countries. And I mean, I think if we can help women to be at the forefront of those changes and to ensure that they're represented in parliaments and part of those processes of change, I think it does present opportunities for women.
Yeah, but I want to add that in order to make that a reality, we need to empower women. Because one of the things that I've been asking myself, we have celebrated 10 years of Security Council Resolution 1325, and we had advanced in a lot of resolution in terms of how we try to prevent women as victims on rape, of violence, and so on. And we're doing pretty well compared to many years ago. But still, we're not doing so well in terms of women being a very important part on the reshaping of their society. They're not sitting on the peace talks. They're not sitting on the table. And the reason is because they're not powerful enough. They don't have constituencies. They didn't have the guns. So who is sitting there? The ones who had the guns or the ones who had the political power? So that's why for us, empowerment is so like the huge word in all of the different challenges. Because if a woman is empowered politically or economically, she will also, even at the domestic field, it will be in a better condition to confront the situation at home. But also, of course, at the society, at the social level, the community level. And that's why, for us, empowerment is so important. And that's why there are other issues that can be done, too, that are very helpful in this sense. Because you asked me, what else can do governments? And one of the important things that we have been doing in the United Nations is how we introduce much more female contingent, police contingents on armed forces, because they show first that women can be powerful even in the most non-traditional ways, that they can wear guns and uniforms and they can use it if it's necessary. And I think that's also a very interesting way of women feel. But also because that has shown that women really, as I said in my initial remarks, really feel more comfortable to go next to them to tell what happened, and the police forces, the female police contingent will do as much as possible. But also in the Liberia case, it was very interesting that much more women wanted to be recruited for this. So you are also shaping in that way, not only in the laws and the policies, but with presence, internal presence of the kind of institutions you're building, so that they will have this gender perspective included in the institution you're building. But I think it's still a very challenging issue, not only in conflict and post-conflict countries. And one of the things is that not everybody can sit in a peace talk. You need to be a leader. You need to be respected. I mean, you have, excuse me to tell it this way, you need to have something to negotiate. So that's why for us it's so important to empower women.
And when we talk about reparations, Laura, we think of justice, but it is very integral to the whole notion of empowerment, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we highlight in the report is there's been these extraordinary advances in international law that have for the first time recognized sexual violence as a tactic of war. But we also urge in the report that there be more of a focus on victims and survivors, so that justice isn't just about punishing the perpetrators, but it's also about the rights of the victims. And in the context of post-conflict, where women bear sometimes the biggest burden of conflict, not only in terms of sexual violence, but in terms of forced displacement and so on. Implementing comprehensive reparations programs can help to empower women so that they're in a position then to be involved in the decision-making processes. So in Sierra Leone, for example, we have UN Women's been supporting a program where women who've survived sexual violence in that conflict have been involved in skills training programs and have received micro-grants to set up businesses so that they can then, in a very tangible way, rebuild their lives and move on.
Outstanding. Let me ask Unity to tell us a bit more about the case that you were involved in. It was highlighted in the report as one of the top 10 most groundbreaking legal cases for women, and you had to take on the Botswanan government to establish your citizenship rights. How has that impacted the issue of gender justice, not only in Botswana, but across Africa?
Okay. Thank you very much. First of all, when you were speaking about how difficult it is to get people, to actually take on a case, I was thinking about myself because it wasn't a class action. We don't have like the idea of a class action, at home. You can have different people who come together as plaintiffs, but the idea of that of a class is not part of our legal system. And in my case, it was, when I started the case, for example, I went around and tried to get people to be part of, because I was clearly not the only woman affected by this particular law that said that citizenship is inherited, if I can use that term, through the male line. At first, I had people, very keen to join me, but later, this, the idea of litigation, it was seen as antagonistic, as confrontational. As a lawyer, I thought it made a lot of sense. But for people who are not lawyers, they said, no, we cannot go against the government. That self-censorship and fear that you can't go against this big entity called government was a big issue. And also the cost. I tell people that when I started the case, I was driving a BMW. I was a young, successful lawyer. When I finished, I was driving a pickup truck, and it's a fact. It just shows you how, at a personal level, it was an investment. My kids were in private schools when I started. They were in public schools when I ended. Of course, when it ended, I could not go to the kind of lawyering that I did before. And then I was sold into the idea of, women's human rights work. So I've not turned back since then. So that is a plus. But what happened, and I think that was important, is that it forced a private and public discussion about the issue of women's human rights. It was in all the papers, it was always on the radio. It forced people to confront the issue. And there was a lot of debate. I was unpatriotic. I was, clearly against the culture. I was really, I was teaching women things that will never, ever, ever happen. It's amazing how forceful people were when you look back. But now I don't think those views are held anymore. I mean, the idea that women are supposed to be equal, or equal, I think is almost now accepted. Whether or not actually realize something else, but I think it's going to be very, very hard to get a room full of people who will stand up and say, I don't think your children should be Botswana citizens, not anymore. So that public discussion was important to frame opinions, to frame a new attitude. And also what also happened, which was good, is that after that, remember it was also I was around the Beijing area at the time. So obviously the activism of Beijing also helped when it came into the mix. So you found that it was an international discussion as well as was a national discussion, which really helped a lot. And after that, what the government did was to actually, first it took 5 years, from first launching the case to actually getting what I was asking for, 5 long years. But at the end of those 5 years also, what happened was not only the government, the parliament changed the law, as I said, it should have been done. They also put into a consultancy that looked at all the other laws that discriminate against women, and over time actually went over and reformed the laws over time. It's taken a long time because you don't reform laws overnight, but actually that process is still ongoing. So it helped.
Have you seen a lot of repercussions? Can you point to repercussions around the African continent?
As a result of that. First of all, the case, actually interesting, 2 weeks ago I was in Zimbabwe, and this lawyer said, when you brought your case, I had a client in my country, Zimbabwe, who was asking an opinion, and I wrote an opinion that was impossible. And they said, then your case was decided, and I said I had to eat humble pie and say it is possible. And I used your decision to get the same thing in Zimbabwe. So it has been used, I think, all over many cases in Africa. And also, I think now you probably cannot go to law school in the Commonwealth, area, jurisdiction, without learning about the case as one of the cases that, or at least comment on women's human rights. So it's, yeah.
Well, Laura, why don't you pick up and let's move into talking about how justice systems really are still affected by custom, by religion, by ethnicity. In some countries, obviously, different family laws for people from different groups. In many places, the formal justice system is really limited because if you can't get access, regardless of the state of the laws, they will rely on other methods to resolve grievances, and therefore the differences, the custom, tradition, oftentimes dictates the outcome. Tell us a little bit about the challenges and opportunities here.
We found that, I mean, Unity will speak much more eloquently about this than I will, but we found that in every country of the world, there's often more than one legal system in place, and that can create complexity in the justice system. It can be more complicated for women to navigate more than one system. But I mean, in the report, we found that all justice and legal systems contain elements of discrimination against women, and those that are based on custom or religion or ethnic identity are no different. But as with as with all legal systems, women are campaigning to eliminate the discriminatory elements in all justice systems, and I think the key thing really is for us to support those efforts. And I mean, the UN Women's Rights Convention, CEDAW, which almost all countries in the world are signed up to, says that all legal systems must support women's rights. And so governments really have a responsibility to ensure that women can access justice in whichever system they decide to approach. And one of the things that I think has been really important in South Africa and other countries is where you have constitutional guarantees of equality, and it's very clear that those apply to customary systems and to other systems based on religious identity or whatever. And then that gives women, the chance to bring about change from within.
Unity, give us some of the strategic goals or tactics that you were able to use that can be utilized now in confronting that problem of customary systems and customary traditions and getting the access necessary to bring about the change.
First of all, just to agree with Laura that you find discriminatory provisions in all legal systems, just including customary law or customary systems. I think it's easier to reform statutes because if you can agitate, if you can advocate for change and lobby for change, they can actually be removed from the statute books. It's very, very difficult to change customary norms that are not written, because that's how people live. So, I mean, although they're also supposed to conform or to be under the umbrella of the Constitution, they can have a life of their own, even if you have these brilliant constitutions, because they're not easy to actually target and change. And also they're not easy to target and change because, often customary systems are very, very accessible to people. There's just, in terms of where the courts are, in terms of the language of the court, just in terms, that's what people do every day. So they feel more comfortable in those systems, and also they're cheaper in terms of access to those systems. So there's that as well. But in terms of some of the strategies that we have used, for example, in Botswana, for example, we had a child support law, child maintenance law that was really, really discriminatory against women in terms of the amount that the mother can get, in terms of the time within which she can complain, which if you don't bring a case within 2 years, that's it. And all kinds of rules. Clearly, although it was a statute provision, it was based on customary notions of, who is supposed to take care of a child of an unmarried mother. So what did we do? We realized that the only way we're going to change this law, is to come up with, a strategy. So I had more than 200 clients, with this particular problem. Instead of using a class action, because we don't have that, I filed, one case after the other, framing the issue as a constitutional issue of gender equality. That meant that I could avoid the magistrate's court and go to the higher court, because I was saying there's a constitutional issue. I mean, there's a discrimination issue that unmarried mothers are being discriminated against as opposed to married mothers, and also as against the fathers, of children's children. And I realized that if I can file 20 cases a day, the high court cannot work, because they have to actually take in my cases. When they said you must consolidate, I said, no, my clients don't want a consolidation. They want every case to be heard on its own merit. It meant actually the court could not function, literally. You know.
Strategy, right here.
And the result was Parliament filed into court and passed a law that was that actually gave women equal rights as men to child support. So again, it's a strategy that for me worked in that particular country, as an example. Yeah.
That's fabulous. Yeah. David. It's amazing. Forget the law. Just human nature. What can we do? Just stop the process. Just stop the process. David, in looking at the Velez case, and particularly in light of Walmart, when I was listening to Unity and Laura, I started thinking about the role of custom and tradition in our law. We may think that we're relying on statutes and case precedent and the rest of that, but the attitudes about so many of these issues are really custom and tradition. But what are the broader ramifications of the decision in the Velez case? And tell us a little bit about understanding how even in a country that is, allegedly run clearly by the rule of law, how that can shift and change a la the Walmart decision.
Well, there are ramifications at Novartis and there are ramifications societally. The ramifications at Novartis are severe. As a result of the jury verdict, we got to construct a package of reforms that Novartis has to implement. And those reforms are wide-sweeping, and they affect virtually every aspect of an employee's existence at the company. So there are changes in the pay practices, in the promotion practices, in the management development programs. There are experts that are hired to do adverse impact analyses to make sure that the statistical differences don't continue, and if they do, there are reporting requirements back to the court, back to the attorneys, so that we monitor this over the next 3 years and implement further changes if we need to. So there are significant moral benefits to that verdict. Societally, I think it's significant. Anytime you get a jury verdict to come back with a verdict of $250 million, people take note. But beyond that, and much more significant than that, I think is the reputational harm that's done to a company, the reputational harm that's done to a brand. That's what companies care about. And I think that in looking at the Novartis case and looking at the verdict and looking at that reputational cloud that was over Novartis for 7 years, I think companies would rationally develop strategies to avoid that and to get out of that if they're faced with it. It's very difficult, as we talked about, to bring these cases. You have a brilliant strategy that works for you, and that may be a strategy that's going to have to work for us going forward in the United States. But in the old days, I was growing up in New Jersey in the 60s, and on the beach there was a sign I'll never forget: no blacks, no Jews, no dogs allowed. And I'm Jewish, and you can see that sign, and in the old days you could have that as Exhibit A. If you go into court, you know where the dividing line is, you know who your enemies are. Now it's a lot more complicated, and it really does require a lot more effort to uncover that kind of evidence of discrimination, because you typically don't have those signs that hit you in the face. The decisions that are made in the back rooms, and to ferret that out just requires a lot of effort.
Can I ask you to comment on one thought that floated through my head? The importance of actual decisions versus settlements. I mean, settlements are critical. You have clients. You are obligated to negotiate that for them, but there's a very different effect within the justice system if you can settle versus having something on the books.
That's absolutely right, and there is a fundamental tension in litigation for that reason, because we have an obligation to represent our clients as individuals, but we also have a fiduciary obligation to the class. So if we bring a case as a class, we have dual obligations, and sometimes those obligations are in conflict, and sorting that out is not so easy. But when we have that conflict, we tend to err on the side of operating for the class and not the individuals. The individuals we represent, we tell early on that they have a fiduciary obligation to the class, and they have to make best decisions with the class in mind first.
Now, I guess one more step, though, with that is so much of the time we hear about great settlements versus where you have actually gotten your jury verdict that is going to be implemented, entered into the case books. There's a real distinction there. Unity, you're nodding your head, and it's tough, because that puts the lawyer in the position of making history and changing law or benefiting a client or a group of clients.
Right. Well, there is that tension, and you know, it's interesting because you had a case recently. When I think about justice, going back to the initial question, I think about what's required of judges. And one of the things that I think is most important is empathy, the quality of empathy, the quality of empathetic engagement. And when Justice Sotomayor mentioned that in some conference before she was nominated, but it was played by a lot of conservatives in this country, she was vilified for thinking that empathy would be a quality at all that would be revered. And I think it is, and I think that in this past term, what we saw in part was a lack of empathy. I'll just give you one more example. You had a case that was ruled 5-4 against a plaintiff. This was a guy who was on death row, in jail in Louisiana for 14 years. And there was exculpatory evidence, evidence that the prosecution had that showed, or would have shown, that the person was innocent. But that evidence, even though it was required to be handed over, was never handed over. And 14 years later, that evidence came to light, DNA evidence came to light, and the result of that was that the person was released. And he sued the state and won $14 million at a jury verdict, $1 million for every year he was in jail. And after that, the state appealed, and it was affirmed, and it went to the Supreme Court, and Justice Thomas, in a 5-4 decision, ruled that that decision was not right. And the reason he held that is because he said, well, you know, there wasn't deliberate indifference, that the state wasn't deliberately indifferent to this gentleman's constitutionally protected rights. And Justice Ginsburg, in a dissent, and I just have 2 lines from her dissent, highlighting the role of empathy that I think is valuable in a court, she wrote this: "What happened here, the court's opinion obscures, was no momentary oversight, no single incident of a lone officer's misconduct. Instead, the evidence demonstrated that misperception and disregard of disclosure requirements were pervasive. That evidence establishes persistent, deliberately indifferent conduct for which the DA's office bears responsibility." This is a woman who gets it. This is a woman justice of the United States Supreme Court who gets it. But unfortunately, the majority male 5-4 decision doesn't get it. And I think they don't get it in part because they lack that essential quality.
Ms. Bechley, let me ask you to there are differences. Let me ask you, we've got a room full of decision makers, of activists. What advice do you give in terms of taking the report's findings, implementing them, taking the next major step for UN Women?
Well, the report outlines 10 recommendations that, as I mentioned before, they are achievable. We know it works, and if they are implemented, we will be really expanding women's rights and women's access to justice and to so many opportunities. So we need to pass now from a document to reality. But in that passage, we need all the stakeholders here, because I didn't want to intervene because it was so interesting, but when you were hearing here is that the recommendations that we have outlined are so clear, because you were talking about having more women judges, no, that could really understand these issues. We are talking about how we strengthen women's capacities and women's organizations. We are thinking how we can take customary justice and also produce the evolution is needed, and that means we don't have to work only on the top level, but in all the system, but also on the community, and to change real social norms. So I would say we have a lot of recommendations, but in order to make it reality, we need here the commitment of governments, of all our partners, civil society, and all the UN systems, so we really could fulfill what women deserve in the world.
There's that very old saying, it's not what you say, it's what you do. And I think everyone in this room, certainly, and far beyond, knows what's right. But unless we act, I think I read one time that the word power was essentially the ability to act. And a great old Buddhist saying, he who knows and does not act never really knows. So this is the time. We know what to do, and the time is now for action. I want to thank so much our panelists for their participation in the discussion, and of course, everyone in this room for joining us. There's so much work ahead, but this organization will be leading the charge. Now, we want your feedback. Any questions that you've got, there is an email address to gather input, progress@unwomen.org, and of course the website, progress.unwomen.org. Plenty of copies of the reports for you here. Please get your copy before you leave, and take a moment to be involved in the UN Women's What Justice Means to Me video library. As you go out, there's a designated area set up with our camera women ready to record your thoughts, and they'll be just outside the door. You'll be able to see clearly where you might go. I would now ask you to join us at the reception in the foyer and use the opportunity to meet one another, talk about these issues, and certainly come up and talk to the panelists. Thank you so much. We are adjourned.